Well, we're picking up where we left off last week on the Chama water tank. And last week we worked on the base and the legs and the frost box. And this week we're working on the tank. Now the tank consists of the tank, the bottom of the tank, and the roof.
Well, I have a question. I'll never know how those things hold water, so how?
Well, it's the same as the old redwood hot tubs and stuff. I think when you first fill them with water, they leak like a sieve.
Oh, till they swell up.
And then hopefully it's like tongue and groove joints at each joint, and as they swell up, notice too that it's narrower at the top than the bottom, and you keep tightening the bands until it stops leaking, and at the bottom you've got a solid bottom on there, and at the top you don't.
I used to live in a place that was like that. We just kept tightening things till they quit leaking.
That's like the old automatic transmissions. You keep tightening the bands till it quits slipping. We digress. Anyway, the essence of what we're after here is a slightly weathered look. This tank looks ever so slightly more weathered than I'd like it to look, but that's about the look. A sun-bleached yellow tank, sun-bleached wood, and bands that are more or less in place but possibly slipping here and there. So just to sort of jump forward a bit here, here's our half-finished model. Here's the tank, the roof, and the base, and the mechanism that raises and lowers the spout. And that's what we're working on this week.
Well, I'm really liking the roof. Those shingles look like you've hand-laid each one of them.
Which normally I would.
Right.
But in this case, the casting that came with the kit is so nice, I think just proper paint on it and it's going to look wonderful.
Right, it's beautiful.
The Piko kit is really first class, super heavy duty castings because it's intended for use out in the garden. And so everything is built UV resistant and weather resistant and just really rugged. Here's where we left off last week. Last week we built the frost box and the legs and the footings. And so we want to tie into this and, of course, match the look, the same amount of weathering on what we're doing now.
Yeah.
So first up I want to work on the roof. It came as a one-piece casting, super heavy duty, and has really nice shingle detail in it. So the first thing I need to do is get a proper surface primer on it because I'm planning to paint it with the water-based acrylics, and they are not going to stick directly to the plastic. They're going to require a primer. I'm just going to use a rattle can for this. I'm using Tamiya's surface primer that comes in a rattle can. I use a different primer in the airbrush, but I love this Tamiya surface primer. There's several different pieces that are going to be used on the water tank, but the piece I'm most concerned with right now is the finial. This piece right here that goes in the center of the roof, because I have to paint up to that and make sure the color goes up underneath this. So I need to be able to set that in place and see how it's going to look. I'm just using these cheap craft paints that you can buy even at Walmart. They're around $1 a bottle. And then what I do is I kind of skip around on the roof and paint individual shingles with individual colors. And then as I skip around, I end up with a whole lot of different colors on the shingles. I squirt the paint out onto a paper plate, and then I can even mix different colors together. Even having several different colors right in the brush, I like that effect. The one thing you have to watch out for when doing this is the paint is now exposed to the air out on the paper plate, and it starts to set up rather rapidly. And if it gets thick, it'll start destroying the detail in your shingles. So if you just have to be careful, make sure that you keep a nice wet paint on there. If it starts to dry out, squirt out some fresh paint.
that looks neat.
Isn't that fun? At a certain point in time, I kind of start focusing on individual areas rather than just skipping around all over the place. Just only because it's fun to see the finished product starting to take shape. The key is, of course, you have to continue skipping around in terms of color, painting each shingle individually so that each one comes in a slightly different color. You can see here why it's important to keep the paint on your brush fresh. You don't want to cover up any of this surface detail, and if the paint starts getting thick on your brush, it's going to start filling in all of the surface detail here. You want to make sure that the surface detail is not filled in with paint. There are these little roof ridge boards that go on here, and at this point I wanted to get some paint and weather on those, and just to make sure that the colors all match and it all comes together and looks good.
Well, that looks really nice. I love that look.
And I'm tempted to just leave it like this.
Oh yeah.
But it's, you know, it's not quite as weathered as the rest of the tank, so I feel like I need to weather it just a little bit. But boy, I don't want to lose that look. I love the look.
Do you want me to make some pigeons?
We do have pigeons up in the cooling tower.
We do.
And I have white paint.
Yeah.
So
I can make some pigeons.
we could splatter some pigeon
artwork.
But I think what it mostly needs is soot. I mean, there's steam locomotives traveling by here, and the tank and the legs and everything else look quite weathered. So I think I need to tone this down, even though I really love it just like it is. So I decided I would go ahead with a dark wash. I'm actually using pure black here, but as you can see, super watered down. And I'm trying to just get that to flow down into the spaces between the shingles and a little bit right in the ridges on the surface. Understanding that as this dries out, it's going to tend to disappear, but also understanding that if you get too much of this on here, there's no going back. You can add some in, but you can't subtract it once it's there. It definitely gives the roof a more weathered look so that the shingles don't appear to be brand new. The fluid will flow to the bottom of the whole thing here, and it sort of builds up along the edges here. But you can just go in with a dry brush, completely dry brush with nothing on it, and touch it in here, and that brush will just suck this stuff away from the model. It will pool on the surface too, and this is part of the effect that you want. But again, you have to be careful that you don't overdo the effect. You don't want to over-weather this thing. In this case, I'm sort of missing the fresh look that it had before, but I like the weathered look here too. Yeah, you can't have everything. You can't have your cake and eat it too, I guess. Okay, on to the bottom of the tank. We did the legs last week and got the weathering and everything on there. But I want the bottom of the tank now to match the legs. I don't want a different look on the bottom of the tank, other than the fact I want the bottom of the tank to look like water has been leaking out here with some water staining. This time I'm not shooting Tamiya's primer. I'm going to shoot Tamiya a brown, a flat brown, and use that as my primer. Because I think it gives me a little better starting point with the acrylic colors. As I've mentioned before, rattle cans are always done outside. There's way too much overspray with these things to work for them indoors. So we set up a folding table, and we have this cardboard box, this temporary paint booth that we use outside. So anyway, brown rattle can directly on the bottom of the tank. And now I need to sort of match the color of the legs with a couple of important differences. The legs, which I used a color called barnwood, are sun bleached, and they're more sun bleached at the bottom than the top. And so up under here, under the tank, there wouldn't be any sun bleaching. So I think it would be a much darker and, as I say, water stained look up underneath here. I haven't yet glued the legs to the bottom, so it makes it easier to get in there to paint, but I like to set the whole thing in place so that I can evaluate how closely I'm matching the color and making sure that it's going to make a certain amount of sense having these two colors come together here. So I've started by brushing on a tanner color. It's sort of like the barnwood, but darker and more tan, and now I'm applying a first layer of wash. I don't intend this to be anything like the final look, but my plan here is to do that technique that I like to use where I work things back and forth, where I'll apply a wash and then a dry brush and then a wash and then a dry brush. So in this case I'm putting the wash on here using again a pure black, same way I used on the roof, because I think it, you know, a darker color under here is more appropriate. And once that is more or less set up, I can come in and start dry brushing with, I'm actually using that same barnwood color now to achieve a closer color match, and just a little bit of it so the darkness, the dark wash still shows through. And notice that there's, where the dark wash is kind of settled into the cracks, we get something that looks a lot like water staining, which is exactly the look I want underneath here. So I'm putting a couple of different colors here into my brush and then trying to knock most of that color out before I come in, and then just lightly dry brushing over the corners and flat edges and the high points so that I don't disturb the low areas where the stain, the wash has gotten down in there and created that wonderful water staining effect. Once everything is set, I am going to come in here with a little gloss to try to duplicate what you're seeing here, this glossiness down in the cracks that looks like water leakage. So I'm going to try to achieve that by thinning down some gloss clear, and just let it kind of flow down into the cracks. So here's where we're currently sitting once everything has set up. I like the look a lot, but I think a little tiny bit of dry brushing with a lighter color just along the edges. So I'm going to come in here with a somewhat light gray and very, very dry, very, very dry brush, and just kind of nick the kind of nick the edges. I didn't I didn't want to put that much paint out there, but just kind of nick the edges to give it this some very nice light highlights up underneath here. As always with water-based acrylics, you have to let them dry before you can really evaluate what you've got, because they're going to dry much darker than what you see. So here's what this looks like once those highlights dry. So they're not nearly as noticeable, or shall we say offensive, as they were when I was putting them on. So this is, generally speaking, the finished product now, except like I say, I want to come back and add some gloss to make it look wet up underneath here. But I love the water staining effect. That turned out really nice. And of course, keeping in mind that nobody's really ever going to see this, I just enjoy doing it, but you'd have to crane your head around in some kind of a really awkward way to see up under the water tank. I suppose it might show up in photographs and so on, but for the most part, this will never even show. It's just fun to do. And now the drain pipe, the main pipe here that runs from the tank out to the spout, that has to be put together before this assembly can be permanently glued together. I painted the pipe a darker color, and then I came in with Model Master Rust and just airbrushed that over the bottom of the pipe here, because a pipe will tend to be rustier on the bottom than the top. And then a tiny, tiny amount of black wash from the top so that it kind of rolls down to that rusty area, creating that dark line between the rust and the darker part of the pipe. And now to set this whole assembly back onto the legs to see how it's going to look on the layout and how the colors match. And again, like I say, you can't see up underneath there very well, but what you can see, I think that looks great. I'm really happy with it. Okay, onto the tank itself. I'm using Vallejo's dying flesh or dead flesh. It's a disgusting color, but it comes off looking a lot like the weathered yellow that you see on the Rio Grande water tanks. And I just love these Vallejo spray paints, these rattle cans. Boy, does that paint go on nice. And as I've pointed out before, these come with two different nozzles, one for moving a lot of paint, which is what I'm using here, and one for finer details. But in this way, I can really move a lot of paint out there with that nozzle. And then, as always, I'm going on here in fairly light layers. I'm not trying to put it all on at once. And now I can glue the four sides together. They simply slip down into the tank bottom, and that will hold them in alignment while I glue the seams from the inside. And I'm using Plastrux plastic weld and just brushing that along the seams from the inside, being careful that I don't get it down into the seam at the bottom and accidentally glue the sides to the bottom yet. And then, of course, there are the metal bands that hold the whole thing together. So once it's painted and glued together, I applied all of these metal bands around here, which are screwed in with these screws. And then the screws are offset just as they would be on the prototype tank. They don't put those on there in a vertical alignment. They put them on a staggered stair-step alignment this way. And now back to painting. There's that band that runs around the bottom of the tank, and that has to match the rest of the tank. And then, of course, the bands themselves need to have color on them. So now that the whole thing is together, one final coat of the yellow paint from the outside. There's also going to be a pair of decals on here, the Rio Grande Button Herald, two that sort of face the front but off to the sides, and those I'll have to work those in around the bands. But there it is. I'm going to weather the tank now. I don't want it to look quite this pristine. It's got a nice weathered color to it, but now it needs to have actual weathering applied. I had a tiny amount of touch-up to do on the bottom of the tank here where I accidentally got a little overspray up underneath there, but all in all, came out just fine. I think we're ready to go forward now. So first up, I'm going to apply a dark wash again to try to get some dark color up into the cracks around the boards and around the bands, and to try to make it also look again like it's a slight amount of leakage from the tank, like water has from time to time kind of leaked between the boards. Now what I've got to do here is called wet edge painting. I need to go all the way around the whole tank maintaining a wet edge, because if it dries out, you'll actually see the seam where I tied the two sections together. So the only way to avoid that is to keep a wet edge as you're working and go all the way around the tank working out from the wet edge. And then, of course, you are going to end up with a visible seam when you get back to the starting point. There's no way to avoid coming up to a dry edge back at the starting point. And so for that reason, I started at one of the heavy seams where the sections come together, and also at a point on the back of the tank where it's not as noticeable, because there's no way to really cover up the fact that I painted all the way around and painted a wet edge into a dry edge. And it does create something of a line there that's visible. But I want to try to get this down into the seams between the boards. Not too heavy. I don't want this to be too conspicuous. I'm not into that kind of heavy weather. And you can see here just kind of a sense of water leakage and that sort of thing. And now I'm coming back with a dry brush and a somewhat matching yellow color. And I'm just lightly dry brushing over the top of that whole thing. I just want this effect down in the cracks for the most part. And for that reason, I'm now going to take the whole thing back outside. And this is, I'm just lightly misting the yellow color, the Vallejo yellow color, just from very far back. I just want to put a light mist on here to diminish the effect of the dark color down in the cracks. I just want to bring out the yellow. I'm going to live with this for a while, and if I decide I want a little more color down in the cracks, I will add that. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy with this. Okay, on to the spout mechanism. The spout goes up and down. Again, they've made this kit so you can actually make this function and run water out into your live steam engine if you want to. Where I want the mechanism to be fully functional, or operational I should say, I'm not planning to run water through it, no. My main goal, of course, is to just make it look really cool, make it look nice. So I painted the wood part of the mechanism using the exact same technique that I'd used on the legs, and then painted the spout the same way I painted the pipe that comes out from under the tank, using a dark gray, almost black, but not quite, and then layering that Model Master rust that I like so much, especially along the top surface, not so much the bottom surface, so that the part exposed to the sun rusts more. And then I threw the chains into a little cup of that ferric chloride circuit board etchant that I like so much for rusting things. It takes the chrome right off the chains because they look pretty silly when they're bright, shiny silver. And then I threw the counterweights into the same bath of ferric chloride to see if it wouldn't kind of rust the surface of those, and boy, it sure did. They look great. The pins that align the whole thing will hold it in place without gluing. I mean, it isn't on there very, very well and it wants to fall off. But I don't want to permanently glue it just yet until I figure out the decals on there, in case I need to remove one of the bands in order to put the decals on here. So I'm not permanently attaching this just yet. But it works just great. It goes up and down, and it even has a wonderful squeaky sound to it. That's great. Whoa. Eventually that'll be glued. And now on to the water gauge. What was supplied with the kit I found completely unacceptable. It's just a strip of plastic with a decal on it. And once I set this in place, I thought that just doesn't look right at all. For one thing, it's supposed to have a little pointer on there, and so I went ahead and built something that looks much closer to the actual water measuring thing deal, the gauge, the water gauge. And I thought it would be fun, just for fun, to make it so that it actually goes up and down. Again, none of this is going to be functional. It's just kind of fun to see if you can't make it operational, just as a modeling challenge.
That's pretty crafty.
Isn't that sweet?
That's really cool. Look good on
So
the top.
the float floats to the top.
Uh-huh.
The weight sinks to the bottom. As the float sinks to the bottom, the weight is pulled to the top.
Well, there you go. That's how it works. Cool.
Here again, I'm just temporarily sticking it in place to see how it looks. I'm not going to glue it in place because I may need to remove one of these bands in order to put the decals on. Well, there it is. Basically, it's done.
Right.
It just needs its decals, and then, of course, it needs to be set in place permanently on the railroad.
Exactly.
And that means building the path out to the hobo camp and the outhouse and all that.
Oh, fun.
So that's next week.
All right.
But I think overall, the weathered wood and the sun-bleached yellow, it looks pretty much like an actual tank on the Rio Grande.
Sure does. It just needs water leaking out of it.
And I'm thinking of trying a thing like that.
Oh, I've got some ideas.
So hopefully everybody's going to want to follow along with that. So if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please subscribe. And you can do that by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday with a painting trick.
Oh boy.
See ya.
We'll see ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.